Picture Rome at the height of its power, the city of 7 hills gleaming under the Mediterranean sun, marble palaces rising like mountains of stone and glass. The Senate House echoing with voices draped in white togas, debating the fate of provinces stretched across 3 continents. Gladiators battling for their lives in the Colosseum, while thousands roar with a passion that shakes the ground beneath your feet. In the minds of most, this is the Rome that endures an empire of glory, conquest, and spectacle. A civilization that left aqueducts and amphitheatres still standing centuries later, a society taught to us as the pinnacle of human achievement. But history is never so simple. Rome's brilliance cast long shadows, and within those shadows lived a world that few dare to confront. Behind those gleaming facades and triumphal arches beyond the triumphs inscribed on marble, there existed chambers filled not with celebration, but with silence and suppressed terror. For within the households of Rome's most powerful families another story was written, not on public monuments but in the tears of children forced into womanhood long before their time. It is easy to be dazzled by empire, to focus on the grandeur of armies and emperors, of Caesar crossing the Rubicon or Augustus reshaping the Republic into monarchy. But peel back the gilded mask of Rome and you discover something more disturbing, a civilization that institutionalized fear using marriage itself as a weapon of control. These were not love stories. They were not partnerships of equals. They were transactions rituals designed to break spirits and bind girls into roles from which there was no escape. To outsiders, Roman weddings were celebrated with the music feasts and bright garlands of flowers. To those inside, particularly the young brides who sat trembling beneath their veils, the same events felt more like funerals for their childhoods. Every gesture, every song, every ritual was designed to remind them that they were not entering into a bond of affection, but being handed over as property. What history remembers as the splendor of Rome was built upon foundations of private suffering, normalized and even sanctified by the religion, law, and tradition. This is the Rome you will not see in textbooks or marble statues. A Rome where the screamsets of the arena were mirrored by the quiet sobs behind palace doors, where daughters of senators, generals, and emperors found themselves used as pawns in games of dynastic ambition, where the price of empire's glory was measured not only in blood spilled on foreign battlefields, but also in the lost innocence of its youngest women. Tonight we will step into that hidden world. We will walk past the arches and into the private chambers where history's most powerful women began their lives not with honour, but with terror. And once you have seen this, Rome, the polished mask of marble and triumph, may never look the same again. Hey there! Before we go on, tap like and subscribe if these stories make you pause, reflect, or smile. And now tell me, where in the world are you joining me from tonight, and what hour has history found you at? I want to hear your story. 12 years old. That was the age the Romans wrote into law as the threshold of marriage for girls. Not 16, not 18, 12. A child barely old enough today to be in middle school suddenly declared by imperial decree to be a woman, her body and her future placed in the hands of men, often twice, even 3 times her age. This was not a matter of ignorance, e.e. Rome was no stranger to medicine, to philosophy, to the observation of human development. They had physicians who warned against the dangers of early childbirth, jurists who understood consent and capacity. Yet the law was clear. 12 years marked the moment a girl could be bartered, exchanged, or gifted into marriage. Why 12? The answer lies in Rome's obsession with fertility and dynasty. Girls were not seen as daughters so much as investments. To marry them young was to extend their reproductive window to maximize the number of children they could bear for the glory of the family name. A girl married at 12 might by 25 already have birthed a dynasty. To powerful men this was not a tragedy. It was efficiency. It was politics disguised as law. Contrast that with our own modern standards. In most nations today, the age of marriage hovers between 18 and 21. Even in societies that once permitted child marriage, international law now recognizes it as a violation of basic human rights. The gulf between our moral compass and Rome's legal reality is staggering. Imagine looking at your 12-year-old niece, cousin, or daughter and being told that she must marry a man of 30, 40, even 50. In Rome, that was not scandal, that was civilization. And make no mistake, the law did more than permit these marriages, it encouraged them. Roman families competed with one another to secure alliances quickly before rivals could claim the most fertile daughters. A girl's first menstruation was seen not as a personal milestone but as a public announcement that she was ready to be transferred. Men too often delayed marriage until their 20s or 30s, not because of prudence but because political timing required it. They waited until they were established, wealthy and ambitious. Then they reached down into the ranks of girlhood to claim wives who could give them heirs. What this created was a brutal arithmetic of power. On one side, young girls, innocent, unprepared and voiceless. On the other, men seasoned by war politics and years of control over others. The imbalance was deliberate. Roman law treated girls not as individuals with rights, but as extensions of their fathers, until the moment they became extensions of their husbands. 12 marked the handover point, the precise legal age when childhood could be stripped away in the name of family advantage. It is easy to dismiss this as ancient cruelty, but pause for a moment. These were the same people who gave us the architecture we still admire, the legal frameworks we still study, the literature we still read. They debated philosophy with eloquence, while normalizing laws that made children into commodities. It forces an uncomfortable question: how much of our modern admiration for Rome rests upon structures built out of the suffering of its most vulnerable? To stand in Rome at that time, surrounded by marble and spectacle, was to live in a world where the law itself enshrined terror as policy. 12 was not just a number. It was the gateway into a system that deliberately fed young girls into dynastic machinery. It was the moment innocence was converted into strategy and a child became a bride in the eyes of empire. Imagine a girl of 12 or 13. She has spent her life in the sheltered company of women, her mother, her sisters, her nursemaids. She has never walked alone through the streets of Rome. She has never spoken in the Senate, never commanded servants, never tasted independence. Then one morning she is dressed in bridal white, her hair braided and bound in the style of matrons, and she is told that her childhood ends today. She is to leave her family home and walk into the arms of a man she barely knows, a man twice, even 3 times her age. The fear is unimaginable, and yet it was expected. Roman society demanded that a bride display trembling, weeping and terror. A calm or curious girl was seen as suspicious, unfit, perhaps already spoiled. Her very fear became proof of her value, and so the young bride sat under her veil, eyes blurred by tears, knowing that to show strength would only invite doubt. Older women whispered warnings in her ear, but they were not words of comfort. They spoke in riddles, hinting at blood, at pain, at the duty she must accept without question. There was no education about her own body, no explanation of desire or intimacy, only the shadowy promise of suffering. The ignorance was deliberate. A girl unprepared was a girl more easily subdued. Now imagine the moment when the ceremony ends and the bride is led away. She enters a chamber alone with her new husband, a man seasoned by war or politics, perhaps with the hardness of years etched into his face. He is a stranger in every sense, yet by law he owns her entirely. She cannot refuse him, she cannot leave. Her very existence has shifted from being her father's daughter to being her husband's property. The medical consequences of such unions were no secret. Serenus, one of the most respected physicians of antiquity, warned explicitly against early sexual activity for girls. He documented torn flesh complications in childbirth and the psychological scarring that could haunt a girl for life. Others wrote of prolapse hemorrhage and infections that ended lives before they had truly begun. Even with these warnings, society did not hesitate. Political advantage outweighed medical danger. Consider the arithmetic of terror, a girl still learning, her letters placed in bed beside a man of 30 or 40. She is expected not only to endure him, but to produce children for him. And if she fails, she risks divorce, disgrace, or worse, because her worth is measured in heirs, not happiness. For the child bride of Rome, the wedding night was not a passage into love, but a plunge into servitude. Her tears were not private sorrows, they were public evidence of her purity. Her silence was not ignorance by accident, it was ignorance by design. And as the door closed on that first night, she understood, perhaps dimly, that her childhood had been not merely lost, but stolen. To understand Roman marriage is to understand that daughters were not daughters in the sense we imagine today. They were commodities, pieces in a game of political strategy, tokens of exchange between ambitious men. A son might inherit, but a daughter could be traded. And in Rome, the trade was rarely for her benefit. A girl's value rose not with her education or her character, but with her ability to bear children. Fertility was power. The younger the bride, the longer her childbearing years stretched ahead of her, and the greater her worth on the marriage market. Families calculated this like accountants tallying ledgers. A girl of 12 could offer 20 years of potential pregnancies. A woman of 20 offered fewer and therefore was less valuable. Examples from Roman history reveal the cold calculus. Octavia, the sister of Augustus, was married off to Mark Antony in a bid to secure peace between 2 rivals. She was praised for her loyalty and beauty, but her true purpose was to glue together a fragile alliance. When the political winds shifted, she was discarded, her body's usefulness as a political bridge having expired. Even in the imperial household, marriage was never about affection. Claudius married his niece Agrippina not because of desire, but because she could deliver him legitimacy and a dynastic heir. She in turn pushed her son Nero into position, ensuring her survival in a world where survival was never guaranteed. At every level of Roman society, the exchange of girls served the same function to consolidate power, wealth, and lineage. The transaction was often brutally public. Fathers announced the engagement of their daughters as though they were announcing a land sale. Friends and rivals measured the worth of a marriage contract, though the same way they measured estates and villas. The bride's feelings were irrelevant. What mattered was the family's advancement. Even marriage contracts spelled out the terms in language closer to business than to love. Dowries were negotiated clauses included to protect a husband's claim to property. A daughter's future was reduced to parchment and seals her life outlined in ink long before she ever glimpsed the face of the man she would be forced to call husband. This is the grim irony Rome. The empire that gave the world a legal code still admired today codified the treatment of girls as bargaining chips. The very civilization that prided itself on justice and order created a system in which the lives of its daughters were currencies to be spent in the pursuit of power, and so the imperial palaces and senatorial estates were filled with brides who were not wives in any modern sense but living investments. Their bodies bore the weight of alliances, their wombs carried the hopes of dynasties, and every tear shed beneath a bridal veil was less about personal loss and more about the brutal reality of a society that saw its daughters not as people but as currency in the greatest game of all empire. The Roman wedding was not merely a private union between two people. It was theatre carefully staged, meticulously scripted, and designed to send a message not only to the families involved but to the wider community. Every detail was symbolic, every gesture rehearsed. For the groom it was a performance of power. For the bride it was a performance of fear. The rituals began with the veil. Roman brides wore the flammeum, a heavy orange-red covering that shrouded the face and dimmed the world around them. To later Christian writers, the veil became a symbol of modesty, but in its Roman context it served another purpose. It isolated the girl, separating her from the safety of her family and friends. It was a shroud as much as a garment, a reminder that she was leaving behind her identity as a daughter and entering a new life in which she would be consumed by her husband's household. The white tunic she wore, woven in a single piece and tied with the knot of Hercules, signified purity. But purity in Rome was never about innocence in the modern sense. It was about readiness for sacrifice. White was the colour of offerings laid at the feet of the gods, and the bride herself was the offering. She stood before the altar trembling as though prepared for slaughter. Fear was not an unfortunate byproduct of this ritual. It was a requirement. A bride who smiled or held herself confidently risked suspicion. Did she already know too much? Had she already given herself to another man? Only tears visible trembling and bowed head could prove her virginity. Terror became the evidence of virtue. Even the words spoken echoed this cruel logic. Priests invoked blessings not of love but of fertility and submission. The songs sung by guests referred openly to conquest, penetration, and the bride's new status as property. It was theatre not of affection, but of domination. The procession reinforced the message. Carried across the threshold, the bride was shown she could not enter her husband's home by her own will. She was lifted, sometimes dragged across the doorway, as if she were plunder seized in war. To the Romans, marriage was not the joining of equals, but the conquest of one household over another, enacted through the body of a girl. Taken together, these rituals stripped the bride of agency at every turn. She could not see clearly beneath her veil. She could not speak without fear of dishonouring her family. She could not step into her new life under her own power. Her psalmos, her tears, her very helplessness were celebrated as the highest virtues a woman could display. In the theatre of terror that was a Roman wedding, purity and sacrifice became indistinguishable. The bride was not entering into the partnership, she was being surrendered. And as the rituals unfolded, everyone watching understood what was truly being celebrated, not the beginning of love, but the triumph of male dominance enshrined in law, ritual, and spectacle. There was a god in Rome who did not thunder from the clouds or stride across battlefields. He waited in dim shrines carved as a single unblushing symbol. Mutunus Tutunus, household guardian of fertility, was not a god of poetry or victory, but of the blunt arithmetic the Romans prized unions that produced children lineages that survived. To him brides were brought. Ancient sources describe a ritual that makes the blood run cold. Before a Roman bride's marriage was consummated, she was led to Matunus Tutunus and made to sit upon his phallic image. Later Christian writers would insist this was not metaphor. It was initiation rough public and meant to break resistance. Even if we grant the historian's caution that the exact mechanics are debated, the intention is not the ritual announced that a girl's body had crossed a threshold not in privacy but under the eyes of law, religion and family. Whether literal penetration occurred or the act was a forced humiliating contact, the message was identical: from this moment your body is subject to the demands of fertility and to the will of your husband. The Romans were not unique in linking marriage to the soil's fruiting and the wombs. Mesopotamia had its sacred marriage rite joining king and priestess to reenact divine union and ensure abundance. In Greece, festivals like Anthesteria paraded phallic emblems through laughter and wine, while Demeter's rites framed fertility as a cycle of loss and return. In India, the lingam would become a symbol of generative energy interpreted by theologians as cosmic principle rather than crude display. But the Roman practice as presented by its own commentators feels different in temperature, an aim less invitation to cosmic mystery, more engineered humiliation for a child on the brink of a forced life. This difference matters. In many cultures, fertility processions were noisy, communal, and symbolic, an attempt to align human life with the seasons. In Rome's elite marriage machinery, Matunus Tutunus stands out as a god enlisted to discipline female bodies. The ritual did not simply bless a couple, it rehearsed dominance. It prepared a girl, often scarcely past menarche, to meet her husband with the fear that Roman society considered proof of virtue. The shrine was a vestibule to the marriage bed, and the operation was the same: instill terror, require acquiescence, call it piety. Listen to the after voices. Lactantius, writing with the moral fury of a convert, decries what he calls the shameful worship that stains Rome's dignity. Arnobius piles scorn on a city that could dress obscenity in the language of devotion. Augustine, passing the old gods with loyally patience, lingers on how rituals form souls. Even the sceptical Tertullian master of the cutting phrase finds in these practices a diagnosis of empire itself. When a civilization can make sacred the spectacle of a child's submission, what won't it excuse? Their denunciations are not neutral reportage, and historians rightly handle them with tongs. Christian polemic had every incentive to paint paganism in the darkest possible colours. Yet their disgust is also a witness to how the ritual was perceived by thoughtful people who lived within a Roman world, and yet could not stomach what that world asked of its daughters. Even if the rite's precise form remains contested by scholars, the cultural function does not its socialized fear, preempted resistance, and recast coercion as holy. Imagine the choreography. A girl 12 or 13, hair parted with the spearpoint comb of matrons veiled in the flammeum that burns like sunset. She is led by hands that love her, and hands that own her, to a shrine that tells her what both sets of hands expect. The statue is cold. The watching eyes are warm with approval or calculation. The room smells of oil and incense. Someone murmurs an invocation: health, sons, and unbroken line. Somewhere in that murmur is the iron you will endure. If you search for kindness in the ritual, you will not find it in the stone. The supposed kindness lay in its utility, at least so fathers told themselves. Better, they would argue, to prepare the girl to prevent the first night from being more difficult. But even this veneer breaks under inspection. Preparation implies care. What happens in the shrine is not care, it is a lesson in power. The god's phallus is the stand-in for a husband's rights, and the girl's shudder is the proof that she understands them. Set Rome beside its neighbours and the severity sharpens. Greek comedy is bawdy, yes, but its licentious chorus is a mask, the Dionysian release that resets a community. Egyptian marriage contracts practical to the last line do not ritualize terror. They itemize property, not humiliation. The Etruscans, Rome's early teachers in many arts, left tomb paintings where banquets show women and men reclining together as persons, not simply as conduits for lineage. Against this spectrum, Matunus Tutunus is unmistakably Roman pragmatic legalistic material to the point of brutality. There is another dimension superstition in the service of control. The Romans feared the evil eye hostile spirits, the caprice of fortune. In such a world, a fertility god was a talisman against failure. If an heir did not appear, it could ruin alliances, end lines, topple plans that reached across generations. A ritual that promised to placate fate would be irresistible to men who built their identities on continuity. But fear of fate when yoked to power becomes a convenient excuse. This is for the gods, says a father who has just traded his child. The church fathers, for all their rhetoric, do help us name the moral geometry. Lactantius calls the rite filthy. Arnobius calls it mad. Augustine subtler notes how society's worship educates its desires. If the divine is configured as conquest masquerading as blessing, the worshipper will learn conquest as a virtue. After centuries of such lessons, conquest needs no altar. It has a household. And the household is where the ritual leads. After the shrine, the procession. After the procession, the threshold. After the threshold, the bed husband unties the knot of Hercules, a virile puzzle only he may solve. A chain of acts, each one symbolic, but never merely symbolic, each teaching the same theorem: the world has been arranged so that your will bends. Perhaps the braver among the women tried to rewrite the ritual in memory. I only touched the stone they only meant to bless me. People survive by editing the scenes that would otherwise crush them, but the body remembers what the mind cannot say. The shiver becomes caution, the caution becomes silence, the silence becomes a tradition others will one day defend as civilization. What is left then? When the shrine is dust and the god is a museum. Footnote: the echo is left an empire that could sanctify a girl's humiliation as a civic good. And because rituals are the slow scripts of nations, the echo travels. It reaches the wedding songs that joke about conquest, the laws that erase a wife's legal self, the expectations that call fear modesty. It reaches too into palaces, where future empresses, brilliant, dangerous, scarred, learned their first lesson at a stone pedestal. Whether Matunus Tutunus truly deflowered brides in every case will remain for scholars a tangle of texts and probabilities. For the girls, the distinction scarcely mattered. The rite's purpose was fulfilled the instant she was made to perform her submission. Rome's genius was to convert power into procedure, brutality into custom, and to ask a god to nod while it did so. When we return to the marble mask of Rome, the arches, the baths, the law to admire its engineering, we should remember the little shrines behind the engineering. The empires of men do not stand on stone alone. They stand on rituals that teach the young what to fear. In the hush of Matunus Tutunus's chamber, a child learned her first Roman lesson, and she did not forget it. If the veil announced the bride's fear and the fertility god rehearsed her surrender, then the belt was the final seal. At every Roman wedding, the girl wore a special girdle fastened around her tunic. It was tied in what the Romans called the knot of Hercules the hero, famed not only for his labours, but for his role as a symbol of masculine virility. Hercules, who fathered dozens of children, became the patron of fecundity, and by binding the bride's body with his knot, Rome made her fertility the husband's exclusive prize. The knot itself was no ordinary fastening. It was deliberately complex, woven so that only the husband could undo it. On the wedding night, when the bride was led into the chamber, the ritual began not with tender words or gestures of care, but with the untying of that knot. This act, performed by the groom's hands, was heavy with meaning. It declared before gods and men that her body had been sealed for him, alone, and that he now held the right to open it. Imagine the psychology of this moment. A 12 or 13-year-old girl, already shaken by veils chants and fertility shrines, stood trembling, while her husband's fingers worked at the knot across her belly. The onlookers knew exactly what this gesture symbolized: not romance, not intimacy, but ownership. The belt was not decoration. It was a lock, and the husband the sole key. In that small act of untying, her body ceased to belong even to herself. The symbolism could not be more explicit. Hercules had subdued monsters, laboured against impossible odds, and now his knot dramatized another conquest, the domination of a wife. The Romans adored such metaphors. To them, marriage was not union, but victory, not companionship, but subjugation. The girl's trembling was proof that the ritual had done its work. Later Roman poets wrote coy verses about the knot, describing it as charming or auspicious. But beneath the poetic gloss lies the cold reality, the ritualized moment when a husband's legal power became physical claim. To untie the knot was to announce to the gods, the family, and the bride herself that the ceremony of conquest was complete. What should have been a private act of intimacy was staged as a public claim of property. Even if no crowd lingered in the chamber, everyone knew the script. The morning after, the proof of consummation, blood on the sheets, would be demanded as evidence. The belt's untying was not romance. It was inventory, the formal opening of an asset transferred from one man's household to another's. For the girl beneath the veil, the weight of that belt was psychological as much as physical. She knew the knot was not hers to loosen, just as her life was no longer hers to command. Her body had become a vessel locked until another hand released it, and from that moment on she lived not as herself but as the possession of Rome's patriarchal machinery. The belt of capture was not a symbol of love, it was a chain dressed as ritual declaring to all that the girl before them had ceased to be free. When the last song had been sung, when the veil and the knot had been removed, the bride was no longer the same person, not in spirit, not in law. In Roman eyes, marriage was not simply a union, it was a legal death. The girl who had entered as her father's daughter ceased to exist as an independent entity. She emerged reborn not as herself, but as the property of her husband. Roman law had no concept of marital partnership. The legal doctrine was simple manus the hand. With the ceremony complete, the bride passed from the manus of her father into the manus of her husband. Everything she had once owned, dowries, land, inheritances, was absorbed into his household. If she had jewellery given to her as a child, it now belonged to him. If her family had entrusted her with estates, their fruits now enriched his coffers. Even her very body was no longer hers. The Institutes of Gaius, a Roman law manual still studied centuries later, made it explicit the husband had full authority over the wife's life. A father could no longer intervene, and the wife herself had no legal standing to protest. The transfer was absolute. A Roman jurist once observed with chilling bluntness that a wife's person was submerged into that of her husband. Consent as we understand it today did not exist. A husband could not be charged with rape, for the law recognized no crime in a man forcing his own wife. By marrying, she had legally ceased to be capable of refusal. The body was his as much as the land, the cattle, or the villa. And this was not considered cruelty, it was considered order, the proper working of society. Examples in the law codes illustrate the depth of this erasure. A wife could not make contracts in her own name. She could not sue or be sued independently. If she wished to free a slave, she could not do so without her husband's permission. If she inherited property, it flowed instantly into his domain. In effect, she was a legal shadow existing only through the will of the man who claimed her. The social consequences were equally stark. Once married, a woman's voice ceased to carry weight in her natal family. Her brothers, once companions, became distant. Her father, once protector, became irrelevant. Her new life was entirely within the lattice of her husband's kin, and her survival depended on how she navigated that treacherous network. For a 12-year-old girl, the psychological shock was profound. She had not only lost her childhood, but her very identity. The law told her you do not exist apart from him. The rituals told her your fear is your virtue. The household told her your only value is to produce heirs. Rome prided itself on its legal genius, on creating structures so durable that fragments of them still underpin Western law. Yet within that genius was cruelty institutionalized. The same empire that codified contracts and citizenship also codified the legal annihilation of women. For every bride, the wedding was not the beginning of a new life. It was the funeral of her personhood carried out with garlands, songs, and a smile carved into the marble mask of empire. If law erased the bride's personhood, art ensured the world accepted it. Roman literature, far from condemning the terror of marriage, celebrated it, turning trembling into virtue, tears into proof of purity. In poems, plays, and household songs, the weeping bride became a stock image, repeated so often that it hardened into expectation. The poets were the worst offenders. Ovid in his Fasti describes the veil and the trembling maiden as essential ornaments of the wedding, as if fear itself were part of the costume. Propertius, a master of love elegy, lingered over the image of brides, whose cheeks were wet with tears as they left their fathers' homes not as tragedy, but as ritual beauty. Martial ever sardonic quipped about brides who cried so bitterly that one wondered whether their tears flowed from modesty or resistance. Even Catullus, capable of deep tenderness, wrote wedding hymns in which guests openly joked about the bride's terror, singing songs filled with innuendo that reduced her shivering body to entertainment. These were not isolated remarks, they were cultural scripts. When poets penned verses about the sobbing girl beneath her veil, they were not inventing an image, they were reflecting and reinforcing the social expectation that fear was the natural state of a bride. The more frightened she appeared, the more virtuous she was judged to be. The inverse was also true, a bride who walked steadily, who did not cry, risked suspicion. Confidence could be read as evidence of experience, a stain on the family's honour. Roman wedding songs, known as fescennine verses, were notorious for their cruelty. Sung in the procession, they often mocked the bride, jeered about her virginity, and hinted at the night's violent consummation. What modern ears would hear as abuse, Romans heard as festivity. Laughter and ridicule directed at a child on the threshold of her most terrifying moment became part of the celebration. Even visual art carried the same message. Frescoes from Pompeii depict mythological rapes, Europa seized by Zeus in the form of a bull, the Sabine women carried off by soldiers as decorative backdrops for bridal chambers. These images were not warnings but affirmations. They told the young girl in painted form that her suffering was part of a grand, timeless story of female submission. Her fear was not an accident, it was destiny sanctioned by myth. This normalization is perhaps the most insidious part of the Roman system. Terror was not only enforced through law and ritual, it was romanticized through art. To weep was to be pure, to tremble was to be honorable, to resist was unthinkable. The literature of Rome did not offer escape for the bride, it offered her a script in which her tears became applause lines for the audience. And so as Roman poets recited verses about sobbing girls and trembling maidens, they were not only describing weddings. They were training society to see trauma as virtue, to accept fear as proof of chastity, and to ensure that no bride could ever imagine her own terror was unjust. Among the names of Rome's empresses, few echo with such scandal as Messalina. To later historians, she became infamous, painted as a predator, a manipulator, a woman consumed by excess. But to understand the truth of her reputation, one must begin not with the lurid tales of her downfall, but with the night her life was first claimed by empire, her wedding night with Claudius. She was still very young, perhaps no more than 15 or 16, when she was joined to a man who could have been her grandfather. Claudius, awkward, and 50, had survived the blood-stained reigns of Caligula, and Tiberius by pretending to be weak, stammering and sickly, a mask that kept him alive when stronger men were slaughtered. For Messalina, the realization must have been suffocating. She was marrying into a dynasty where survival itself was a performance, where power flowed not from kindness but from cunning and cruelty. The stakes could not have been higher. As the new wife of the Emperor, Messalina's body was no longer her own. It was Rome's. Her value was measured not in affection but in reproduction. Within weeks, the empire expected proof of her fertility, the swelling of her belly, the promise of an heir. Failure meant danger. Divorce, exile, or even execution. Success meant survival, at least for a time. The pressure of that expectation must have pressed on her chest like a weight. Her wedding night was scripted by the same rituals that haunted every Roman bride, the knot of Hercules, the veil, the trembling. But for Messalina, these were not symbolic gestures, they were chains. The untying of her belt was no private moment of intimacy, but a public ritual of ownership. Claudius claimed not merely her body, but her womb as the empire's property. Every Roman knew what was at stake. The dynasty's future depended on her flesh. The sources tell us she succeeded quickly. Not long after Claudius became emperor, Messalina bore him a son, Britannicus, and for a brief moment her place seemed secure. Yet security in the Julio-Claudian dynasty was always a mirage. The very success that saved her also bound her more tightly to a life of scrutiny. Every glance at her, every rumour whispered in the palace weighed her worth as wife, mother, and political instrument. It is no wonder, then, that later accounts describe Messalina's behaviour as increasingly desperate. Tacitus and Suetonius depict her as a woman of reckless appetite, indulging in affairs, schemes, and political betrayals. Historians have long debated whether these accounts reflect truth or slander, but when we place her early terror at the centre of the story, a different picture emerges. Perhaps her later excesses were not evidence of innate corruption, but of survival. A girl forced into the submission at the most vulnerable age had learned quickly that the only way to claw back control was through manipulation, seduction, and ruthless politics. To the Roman elite, this made her monstrous. To us, it makes her human, an adolescent bride, who learned that her body was a battlefield and that the only weapons available to her were those the empire despised in women's sexuality, cunning, and secrecy. On her wedding night, Messalina stepped not into marriage, but into a prison gilded with purple. The trembling girl beneath the veil became the empress whose every breath was weighed against the survival of the dynasty. And if history remembers her as infamous, we must first remember her as terrified. For in the silence of that chamber, Messalina learned the lesson that would define her life in Rome. Survival was bought not with innocence, but with surrender. If Messalina's story was one of youthful terror under the gaze of an older emperor, Livia's story was something colder, more calculated a union that revealed how completely Roman politics could strip a woman of dignity. When she was chosen to marry Octavian, the man who would soon be called Augustus, she was already married. More than that, she was already 6 months pregnant with her first husband's child. In any other culture, such a circumstance might have been scandalous. In Rome, it was debated not for its morality, but for its legality. Could a man take another man's pregnant wife as his own? The matter was submitted to the College of Pontiffs, the keepers of religious law who weighed the decision with clinical detachment. Their ruling was pragmatic. The marriage could proceed so long as the unborn child's paternity was acknowledged as belonging to the first husband. What mattered was not Livia's autonomy, not her consent, not her humiliation, but the smooth transfer of property, lineage, and alliance. The wedding itself must have been a surreal and devastating scene. There stood her first husband, Tiberius, Claudius Nero, compelled to attend the ceremony. He watched as his wife, still visibly carrying his child, was handed over to a younger rising star whose ambition knew no limits. Imagine Livia in that moment, her swollen belly the most public of burdens, her identity torn between the man she had married and the man Rome decreed she now belonged to. The procession, the vows, the songs, all hollow echoes masking a transaction. Psychologically, the destruction was profound. Livia was not only losing her marriage, she was losing control over her body and her child. On her wedding night with Octavian, she knew she was expected to consummate a union, even as her womb already bore another man's heir. The collision of these demands, political, biological, personal still, must have been unbearable. The message was clear: her body was not her own. It was an asset to be claimed as use dictated by the ambitions of men. Yet in this humiliation lay the seed of something darker. Livia, stripped of dignity, learned that survival in Rome's imperial world required coldness equal to that of the men who traded her. In time, she would become one of the most formidable political figures of the empire, maneuvering her sons and grandsons onto the throne, shaping succession with a ruthless pragmatism that mirrored the forces that had once claimed her. To reduce her story to scandal misses the truth. Livia's pregnant marriage was not merely a personal betrayal, it was a public lesson in Rome's priorities. Fertility was currency. A woman's body could be reassigned like territory even in mid-pregnancy, so long as the paperwork of religion and law approved it. And for Augustus, the acquisition of Livia was more than desire. It was strategy. She came proven fertile, already carrying life within her, and to him that made her the perfect imperial consort. In that one moment, we glimpsed the essence of Rome's cruelty: a bride 6 months pregnant, transferred like property, while her husband watched her future rewritten without her consent. If later she became known for her ruthless grip on power, perhaps it was because her first lesson as Augustus's wife taught her that Rome respected only calculation. Her terror and humiliation became the crucible that forged her into the empress whose shadow would dominate the empire for half a century. If fear was the theatre of Roman marriage, ignorance was its script. Roman girls were not merely unprepared for what awaited them on their wedding nights, they were deliberately kept in the dark. Silence was policy, confusion was strategy, terror was the proof of purity. Mothers and aunts might whisper warnings, but never explanations. They spoke of pain, of blood, of duty, but never of desire, never of partnership, never of consent. The fragments a girl received were enough to terrify, but too vague to empower. She was told that something would be taken from her, something she could not get back. She was told it would hurt and that her tears would honour her family. But she was not told what or how or why. The result was weaponized shock. On her wedding night, the bride's ignorance ensured that her fear would be absolute. The moment of consummation was not only physically traumatic, but psychologically overwhelming, an assault compounded by confusion. In that darkness, she learned the lesson Rome demanded: you do not control your body and you never will. Medical writers like Serenus warned of the dangers of such early and uninformed unions. Girls who entered marriage without knowledge or preparation suffered injuries that scarred them for life. Yet society dismissed these concerns. A frightened, ignorant bride was considered more virtuous than one who understood. Knowledge was not protection, it was corruption. To know too much was to risk suspicion of unchastity. This silence was a form of control, passed from one generation to the next. Mothers who had been kept ignorant themselves did the same to their daughters, not out of cruelty but out of resignation. To break the cycle would mean admitting that their own suffering had been needless, that their own terror had not been destiny but abuse. Such an admission was unbearable, so the silence became tradition, and tradition became law. The ignorance was reinforced even in public rituals. Wedding songs spoke openly of penetration and conquest, but never in a way that taught. They mocked, hinted, and jeered so that the girl listening understood only that something frightening and humiliating was imminent. The cruel irony was that men sang with laughter about acts the bride herself could not yet imagine. To modern eyes, this systematic silence looks like neglect, but to the Romans it was policy. An ignorant bride was pliant, a terrified child was easier to dominate than a prepared woman. In the machinery of empire, innocence was not a quality to protect but a weapon to exploit. And so Roman girls walked to the altar with tears in their eyes, clutching half-understood warnings, knowing only that something terrible was coming. Their ignorance was not an accident of the times. It was designer policy crafted to ensure that terror entered the marriage chamber hand in hand with submission. If fear was the theatre of Roman marriage, ignorance was its script. Roman girls were not merely unprepared for what awaited them on their wedding nights, they were deliberately kept in the dark. Silence was policy. Confusion was strategy. Terror was the proof of purity. Mothers and aunts might whisper warnings, but never explanations. They spoke of pain, of blood, of duty, but never of desire, never of partnership, never of consent. The fragments a girl received were enough to terrify, but too vague to empower. She was told that something would be taken from her, something she could not get back. She was told it would hurt and that her tears would honour her family, but she was not told what or how or why. The result was weaponized shock. On her wedding night, the bride's ignorance ensured that her fear would be absolute. The moment of consummation was not only physically traumatic, but psychologically overwhelming, an assault compounded by confusion. In that darkness, she learned the lesson Roman demanded: you do not control your body, and you never will. Medical writers like Serenus warned of the dangers of such early and uninformed unions. Girls who entered marriage without knowledge or preparation suffered injuries that scarred them for life. Yet society dismissed these concerns. A frightened, ignorant bride was considered more virtuous than one who understood. Knowledge was not protection. It was corruption. To know too much was to risk suspicion of unchastity. This silence was a form of control passed from one generation to the next. Mothers who had been kept ignorant themselves did the same to their daughters, not out of cruelty but out of resignation. To break the cycle would mean admitting that their own suffering had been needless, that their own terror had not been destiny but abuse. Such an admission was unbearable, so the silence became tradition, and tradition became law. The ignorance was reinforced even in public rituals. Wedding songs spoke openly of penetration and conquest, but never in a way that taught. They mocked, hinted, and jeered so that the girl listening understood only that something frightening and humiliating was imminent. The cruel irony was that men sang with laughter about acts the bride herself could not yet imagine. To modern eyes, this systematic silence looks like neglect, but to the Romans it was policy. An ignorant bride was pliant. A terrified child was easier to dominate than a prepared woman. In the machinery of empire, innocence was not a quality to protect but a weapon to exploit. And so Roman girls walked to the altar with tears in their eyes, clutching half-understood warnings, knowing only that something terrible was coming. Their ignorance was not an accident of the times. It was designer policy crafted to ensure that terror entered the marriage chamber hand in hand with submission. If the ceremony itself was designed to terrify, the feast that followed was no kinder. What should have been celebration tables spread with olives, honeyed wine, roasted meats, was instead another theatre of domination. For the bride, the wedding banquet was not a moment of relief but the prelude to humiliation. Guests sang what were called fescennine verses, songs notorious for their cruelty. They mocked the bride's virginity, taunted her with crude jokes about penetration, and celebrated the groom's anticipated conquest. The laughter of the crowd echoing through the hall was not gentle ribbing. It was a communal reminder that the girl seated among them was about to be stripped both literally and symbolically of everything she had known. Even in joy, she could not escape fear. The procession to the husband's house extended the spectacle. The bride was carried or dragged across the threshold, never allowed to step through of her own will. This ritualized abduction made clear that she was not entering as a partner but as plunder. It echoed Rome's own founding myths, the rape of the Sabine women, reminding everyone that Roman marriage was conquest dressed in garlands. Inside the marriage chamber, the brutality continued in silence. The husband untied the knot of Hercules, claiming the bride as property. But what mattered most to the wider family was not intimacy, nor even the marriage itself, but proof. The morning after the bloodied sheets of consummation were displayed as evidence. They were kept like contracts, legal documents of flesh and pain, verifying that the transaction was complete and the bride had been a virgin. A girl's most private trauma became public record, her blood paraded as honour for her family and security for her husband. Archaeology reveals how deeply this cruelty was woven into the culture. In Pompeii, frescoes decorated bridal chambers with violent myths. Walls bore images of Europa seized by Zeus in bull form or the Sabine women wrenched from their homes. These were not random artistic choices. They were deliberate backdrops for the wedding bed, reminding the bride that her ordeal was part of a grand narrative of female submission. To be conquered was to be Roman, and to endure conquest was to prove her worth. The irony is brutal in the midst of laughter song, and feasting a girl's terror was both entertainment and evidence. What Rome celebrated as ritual and festivity was in truth the rehearsal of domination. The wedding feast with its crude verses and mocking songs was less about joy than about reminding everyone present that marriage was not union, but conquest sanctified by family myth and law. Rome's genius lay not only in building roads and aqueducts, but in building systems that endured. Its marriage customs were no different. The terror inflicted upon brides was not an accident, it was a design. And its most effective feature was that the very victims became its enforcers. A 12-year-old girl trembling under her veil, weeping through her wedding night, learned quickly that resistance was useless. Survival meant endurance, and endurance demanded silence. In time, that girl became a matron, a mother, the keeper of her household. And when her own daughter reached the age of 12, she prepared her for the same fate. This is the psychology of survival. To admit that her own suffering had been unnecessary would be to unravel the very fabric of her life. It would mean acknowledging that the terror she endured was not destiny but cruelty, not natural order but abuse. That realization would crush her, so she rationalized. She told herself and her daughter that fear was honorable, that tears were proof of virtue, that silence was strength. Generational trauma became generational policy. Mothers passed on whispered warnings not to protect but to condition. It will hurt, but it must be done. Be afraid or they will doubt your purity. These words were not consolation. They were the careful stitching of a wound into a badge of honor. The cycle became self-perpetuating. Girls grew into women who could not challenge the system without tearing apart their own identities, and so they upheld it instead. The system thrived on this paradox. Victims became guardians. The matron who once sobbed behind a veil became the proud hostess of another feast of violence, arranging her daughter's dowry, laughing with guests as songs mocked the trembling bride-to-be. By participating, she proved her loyalty to Rome's traditions, and in doing so she ensured that her daughter would one day do the same. This is how civilizations preserve cruelty, not through constant force, but through teaching the oppressed to believe their suffering serves a higher purpose. Roman women were told that their fear ensured the survival of families, the strength of dynasties, even the stability of empire. And when every woman believed this, the system no longer needed chains or whips. The chains were internal, bound by duty, fear, and rationalization. For over 1,000 years this cycle endured. A bride's terror was not simply a private wound. It was Rome's most enduring system of control written into the lives of women, generation after generation, until it felt as natural as breathing. The brides who trembled beneath veils did not always remain victims. Some of them, forged in the fire of terror, emerged as formidable figures, women who bent the machinery of empire to their will. To understand Livia Messalina, Agrippina, or Julia, one must remember that each of them began as a child offered up in fear. Their ruthlessness later in life was not born in luxury, it was born in trauma. Take Livia. Torn from her first husband while 6 months pregnant, she endured humiliation so profound it could have shattered her. Instead, she transformed it into strategy. As Augusta's wife, she played the long game. She cultivated influence, quietly shaping succession behind the scenes, maneuvering her sons and grandsons into imperial power. Historians remember her as cold, calculating, even murderous. But what else could Rome have expected? A girl who'd been stripped of autonomy learned early that survival demanded control of information, of alliances, of family. In a world where her body had once been a bargaining chip, Livia turned herself into the dealer of the cards. Messalina's trajectory was different, but no less revealing. Married to Claudius, decades her senior, she faced the suffocating demand to bear heirs while living in a palace drenched in paranoia. She delivered a son Britannicus, securing her place, but the fear never receded. Later accounts written by men who despise powerful women portray her as insatiable, reckless, consumed by appetite. Yet beneath the scandal lies a pattern, a woman grasping for control in the only ways Rome permitted her, through her sexuality, her alliances, and her cunning. If she sought pleasures, perhaps they were less indulgence than rebellion, a desperate attempt to reclaim agency in a life defined by submission. Agrippina the Younger followed the same path. Married off at a young age, she endured violation and danger, before emerging as one of the most ruthless political actors of her age. She placed her son Nero on the throne, wielded imperial power as co-ruler, and silenced rivals with deadly precision. To Roman historians, she was monstrous. To us, she may look like the inevitable product of a society that trained its daughters in terror, and then left them no tools but manipulation to survive. What unites these women is not depravity but adaptation. They internalize the lessons of their wedding nights, that fear can be weaponized, that silence hides strength, that survival requires outmaneuvering those who would dominate you. Trauma did not erase their will, it sharpened it. In a world that denied them open power, they mastered hidden power. In a culture that sought to break them, they learned to bend others. And so the empresses remembered in scandal sheets as schemers, poisoners, seductresses, may instead be understood as survivors, girls who were taught on their first night as wives that their lives would never belong to them. To live within such a system required ruthlessness. To thrive required genius. Rome condemned them for it, but Rome also created them. Even in antiquity, there were voices that recognized the danger. Roman medicine was not ignorant of the risks of early marriage. Physicians like Soranus of Ephesus, one of the most respected medical writers of the 1st and 2nd centuries, explicitly warned against the practice of forcing young girls into sexual activity and childbirth. His Gynecology remains one of the most detailed surviving texts on women's health, and within its pages he recorded the stark consequences tearing prolapse, hemorrhage, infection and death. Soranus cautioned that the bodies of young girls were not ready for intercourse, let alone pregnancy. Their bones were soft, their pelvises undeveloped, their wombs fragile. Forcing conception upon them too early, he argued, led to miscarriages, dangerous labours and long-term damage that could cripple a woman for life. He noted that childbirth before the body was mature could cause injuries so severe that some brides never recovered. The dangers were not abstract, they were observable, recorded by doctors who treated the victims. Other Roman medical texts echo these warnings. Writers such as Hippocratic commentators and later Galenic physicians described obstructed labour fistulas and the wasting fevers that often followed childbirth in very young girls. They observed that girls consigned to marriage at 12 or 13 frequently died in their first labours, and those who survived were often left weak and barren or in chronic pain. And yet families ignored these cautions. The survival of a dynasty outweighed the survival of a daughter. Political calculation made individual health irrelevant. If a bride died in childbirth, her family might mourn, but the marriage alliance itself had already served its purpose. Another daughter could be offered in her place. Deaths were considered acceptable losses in the great game of Roman politics. This cold arithmetic is what shocks most today. Rome prided itself on pragmatism, on being a society of order and reason. Yet when faced with the clear testimony of its own physicians, it looked away. A girl's body was not a patient to be preserved, but a resource to be consumed. The psychological cruelty deepened the physical risks. Brides who survived were often permanently marked. Pelvic damage, infertility, and chronic illness meant years of suffering. Yet even this could become another tool of control. A weakened wife was more dependent, less likely to rebel, more bound to the household. Her pain became invisible, absorbed into the machinery of family honour and political advantage. Rome's legacy is filled with contradictions. The same civilization that produced aqueducts, paved roads, and finally argued law also produced a culture willing to gamble the lives of its daughters for dynastic stability. The medical warnings were written in black and white. The tragedies were witnessed in blood and death. But in the shadow of empire, science bowed to politics, and the voices of doctors were drowned out by the ambitions of men. Rome's rituals did not vanish with its emperors. They seeped forward through canon law, court custom, and the dynastic anxieties of kings, until the same choreography of fear appeared beneath different crowns. When we look across medieval and early modern Europe, we find the Roman template adapted to new altars, ritualized submission, political unions brokered over maps, and girls measured as reproductive assets. Canon law set the stage. For centuries, the church recognized a minimum marital age of 12 for girls and 14 for boys, a threshold that kept echoing Rome's calculation earlier: marriage longer, fertility greater dynastic yield. Councils refined form requiring priests and witnesses to curb clandestine vows, but not the core arithmetic. Legitimacy, lineage and property still ran through a girl's body like a treaty inked in blood. In England, secular custom long mirrored this logic. The common law minimums persisted into modernity, a legal undertow that reveals how stubbornly the old math clung to the shore. At court, marriage remained a map. The Habsburgs perfected it: proxy weddings, sealed alliances before brides met their grooms. Papal dispensations bent rules of consanguinity to keep property in the family, even as those loops on the pedigree tightened into peril. Spain's Casa de Austria made matrimony a policy. Its brides shuttled across borders to reinforce a ring of Habsburg steel around Europe. In France, Salic law barred women from the throne, but made their wombs the conduits for male succession. Queens were vessels of continuity praised when sons appeared, blamed when they did not. The age's beggar belief. Richard II of England married Isabella of Valois when she was about 6. The union was political theatre pending a future consummation, yet her childhood was nonetheless confiscated by treaty. Margaret Beaufort, scarcely past 12, endured a pregnancy that nearly killed her and produced the boy who would become Henry VII, an English dynasty carved from a child's peril. Mary Queen of Scots was a bargaining chip from infancy, pledge-shipped and wed to secure a Franco-Scottish axis. Anne of Brittany was married off twice to keep a duchy from slipping the crown. Her body was the hinge on which a province turned. The stagecraft stayed familiar. Bedding ceremonies, ostensibly jovial, paraded the couple to their chamber, before watchful courtiers, a pageant that translated public power into private claim. In parts of Europe, proof of consummation blood on linens could sway lawsuits and succession, turning a girl's pain into evidence her most intimate moment, another ledger entry. If no heir arrived, the diagnosis was swift and almost always feminine. Blame the queen, summon physicians, prescribe pilgrimages, whisper of annulment. Courts treated fertility like siegecraft. If the gate did not yield, the fault lay in the gate. Law followed the same grooves. Non-consummation could void a marriage. Obedience was a wife's legal expectation. Property trailed the husband's name. In royal houses, the calculus was colder still. A bride who miscarried too often might be set aside. A bride who birthed daughters risked quiet exile in her own palace. A bride who produced a male infant was briefly sovereign in all but name. The crown's mercy ended at the cradle. Even art complied. Tapestries and murals retold myths of abduction and conquest. Europa carried off the Sabines, the seized as courtly decoration, a genteel reminder that power takes what it needs. Poems and pageants did what Roman verse had done, make a virtue of fear, a festival of domination. The language softened honour, modesty, duty, but the lesson did not. There were exceptions, and they matter. Some princesses delayed consummation until safer ages. Some queens negotiated terms, brokered patronage, and built patron networks that buffered them from caprice. A few Catherine de' Medici in France, Isabella of Castile in Spain converted the constraints into statesmanship, turning surveillance into intelligence, maternity into a language of rule. But even their triumphs reveal the bar's power was tolerated when it wore the mask of motherhood accepted, when it anchored male succession revoked, when it threatened to stand alone. Across the centuries, the Roman script kept its key scenes: the marriage market as diplomacy, the child bride as treaty, the bed as courtroom, the womb as frontier. Europe changed the costume's chrism instead of the incense ermine, instead of purple but not the stakes. When kings counted heirs, they counted women's bodies as instruments. When realms sought peace, they signed it in girls' futures. By the time statutes began to raise ages and narrow guardians' power, the damage was a lineage of stories that look alike in every language: a procession, a threshold, a lock girdle, a morning of proofs and a life thereafter weighed against suns. Had taught Europe the habit of calling this civilization. Europe for a very long time agreed. The marble palaces of Rome still stand in ruin, their arches casting long shadows across the centuries. Tourists walk beneath them, marvelling at the stones that have outlived empires. But if the stones could speak, they would tell a different story, not of triumph, but of terror. For the echoes that truly haunt Rome are not the cheers of the Colosseum, nor the speeches of the Forum. They are the muffled sobs and stifled screams from the wedding chambers of its most powerful families. These were not isolated tragedies. They were a system. A girl's tears beneath her veil were evidence of purity. Her silence was proof of obedience. Her pain was transformed into ritual sanctioned by God's law and culture. Rome taught its daughters that fear was their duty, and then congratulated itself for the order such fear produced. And it worked. For over 1,000 years, Rome's greatest machinery of control was not its legions, but its households' dynasties maintained on the broken bodies of their daughters. The empire called this civilization. We centuries later call it horror. But the question lingers. What horrors do we normalize today? What systems dressed in ritual and law disguise cruelty as virtue? What practices will our descendants look back on with the same shock we feel reading about 12-year-old brides handed to men 3 times their age? It is easy to condemn Rome. It is harder to turn our gaze inward. Perhaps it will not be veils and knots of Hercules, but something else, children labouring in sweatshops while we wear their clothes. Women trafficked across borders while economies profit. Voices silenced in the name of stability while nations applaud. Each age has its rituals, its justifications, its chains wrapped in garlands. Civilizations are not judged by their monuments. They are judged by how they treat those who have no power. Rome built aqueducts, roads, and laws that shape the world, but its grandeur was underwritten by the screams of girls taught to accept terror as destiny. The echoes remain whispering through time, a warning carved deeper than stone. Beware the cruelties we dress as customs, the injustices we defend as tradition, the suffering we normalize because it feels eternal. Rome's palaces may crumble, but the lesson endures. The true measure of a civilization is not what it builds, but whom it breaks. Lessons from Rome's hidden terrors. When we think of Rome, we often imagine grandeur, marble arches, powerful armies and emperors whose names still echo in history books. But behind that glittering facade was another Rome, a darker Rome, one that revealed how easily cruelty can be dressed as tradition and how suffering can be normalized until it is no longer seen at all. The story of Rome's child brides is not only a history lesson, it is a mirror. It asks us to consider what happens when power is allowed to redefine humanity, when a society values ambition and dynasty more than compassion and dignity. In Rome, this meant 12-year-old girls handed over as political pawns, their tears interpreted as proof of virtue, their bodies treated as property. And for centuries, no one questioned it. The first lesson is this: fear can be institutionalized. Rome turned terror into ritual. Brides were expected to weep, to tremble, to embody submission. What should have been a private pain was transformed into public virtue. It reminds us that whenever a society rewards silence, obedience, or fear as signs of honor, we should pause. Systems of oppression rarely announce themselves with whips and chains. They cloak themselves in garlands, vows, and songs. The second lesson knowledge withheld is power denied. Roman girls were deliberately kept ignorant, told only enough to terrify them, but never enough to prepare them. Ignorance was policy because it ensured control, and in our time, access to truth, whether in education, media, or civic life, remains the foundation of freedom. Silence and secrecy are the oldest tools of domination. The third lesson: trauma perpetuates itself if left unchallenged. Roman mothers who had once wept beneath their veils taught their daughters to do the same. They rationalized their own pain by passing it forward. We see this pattern today when cycles of abuse, prejudice, or injustice are allowed to continue unchecked. Breaking them requires courage, the willingness to say what was done to me was wrong and it will end with me. The fourth lesson: survivors adapt in ways that can reshape history. Women like Livia Messalina and Agrippina became symbols of manipulation and ruthlessness, but their stories look different when viewed through the lens of survival. They had been trained by trauma to navigate a system that gave them no tools but cunning. The broader truth is that hardship often produces resilience, but resilience born of injustice comes at a terrible cost. Our societies must strive to nurture strength without demanding suffering as its price. Finally, the most important lesson: civilizations are judged not by their monuments, but by how they treat the powerless. Rome gave us roads, aqueducts, and legal systems that still influence us today, but beneath those triumphs lay generations of silenced girls. Every society must ask, who bears the hidden cost of our prosperity? Whose voices are we ignoring? Rome's story is not just ancient history, it is a warning. The marble has crumbled, but the echoes remain. They remind us to look closely at our own customs, to question what injustices we have learned to accept, and to measure our greatness not by what we build, but by whom we protect. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.